At 7 a.m. on a Tuesday in January, Evelyn Sterling signed her own name on a document that erased 4 years of her life. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She didn't even look up when the door closed behind him. Roman Voss, the most feared man on the East Coast, had just walked out of their penthouse believing he was shedding dead weight. He had no idea he was throwing away the only person who had ever kept him alive. This is the story of what happened next. If you're watching from your city, drop it in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and follow all the way to the end. You will not want to miss how this one lands. The divorce papers arrived on a Monday. Evelyn found them on the kitchen island when she came downstairs at 6 in the morning, still in the oversized gray sweater she'd slept in, her dark hair pulled back in a knot that had come half loose somewhere around 2A. M. There was no envelope, no attorney cover letter. Roman had simply left them there between the fruit bowl and her cold coffee from the night before, weighted down by a pen, his pen, the heavy matte black one she'd given him 3 Christmases ago. As if the placement alone was a kind of message. She stood there for a moment, barefoot on the cold marble floor, looking at the papers without touching them. The penthouse was already quiet in the way expensive spaces get quiet. A stillness that cost money, thick glass insulating everything from the city 40 stories below. Manhattan murmured somewhere beneath her feet, but she couldn't hear it. She could hear the refrigerator hum. She could hear her own breathing. She could hear, distantly, the shower running down the hall, where Roman was getting ready like it was any other morning. She poured herself a fresh coffee. She sat down at the island. She read. The language was clean, formal, stripped of everything personal, which, she supposed, made it honest. The marriage of Roman Voss and Evelyn Sterling, entered into 4 years prior, was hereby dissolved. Assets to be divided per the prenuptial agreement. No contested properties. No pending litigation. The prenup she'd signed at 26, when she thought love made such documents irrelevant, had been thorough. Roman's attorneys were good. She'd helped hire 2 of them. She turned the last page. The signature line waited. She heard the shower shut off. Evelyn set the document down, wrapped both hands around her coffee mug, and looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the gray January sky pressing down on the skyline. The city was already moving. Delivery trucks, headlights, steam rising from grates in the street below like the whole island was breathing. She watched it without seeing it, her mind running the kind of cold arithmetic she'd taught herself years ago. Not what she felt, but what was true, what was real, what was next. What was true? The marriage had been dead for longer than the papers acknowledged. What was real? She had known this was coming for 8 months and had spent those 8 months quietly, methodically preparing. What was next? She had to decide in the next 5 minutes what her face would look like when Roman walked into this kitchen. She heard him in the hallway. The particular sound of his footsteps, unhurried, heavy, the walk of a man who had never once moved through a room expecting resistance. She'd cataloged that sound without meaning to, the way you learn the rhythms of any space you've lived in long enough. The building's elevator had a specific shudder before it opened. The heating system clicked twice before it kicked on. Roman's walk said, I own whatever floor I'm standing on. He came into the kitchen already in his suit, black, tailored, the kind that didn't need a tie to communicate authority. He was 41 years old and looked like the decade had been good to him. Sharp jaw, dark eyes, the kind of physical presence that made rooms recalibrate. He went to the espresso machine without looking at her. He worked it with practiced efficiency, movements clean and economic, a man who'd trained himself never to waste motion. He did not say good morning. She did not say it either. For a full minute they existed in the same space without acknowledging the papers on the counter between them. Then Roman picked up his espresso, turned, and his eyes landed on her. Not the papers, her, with an expression she recognized. It was the expression of a man who had already finished a conversation in his head and was now waiting for the other party to catch up. You read them, he said. Yes. Anything you want to discuss? Evelyn looked at him. She thought about all the things she could say, all the true things, the sharp things, the things that might actually penetrate whatever he'd constructed between himself in this moment. She thought about saying, I built half of what you're standing on. I thought about saying, you've been making a mistake for 8 months and you don't know it yet. She thought about asking him, plainly, if he understood what he was actually doing. She said, "No." Roman nodded. He drank his espresso in 2 swallows and set the small cup in the sink. He checked his phone. Whatever was on the screen occupied him for a moment, something shifting almost imperceptibly in his jaw. Tension, or maybe satisfaction. She'd stopped being certain she could read him accurately. He pocketed the phone. "My attorney will be in touch about the timeline." He picked up his jacket from the back of a chair. "It should be straightforward." "I know," she said. He paused. For just a second, standing there with his jacket over one arm, he looked at her with something that wasn't quite the clean certainty he'd walked in with. It lasted about 3 seconds. Then it was gone. "Take care of yourself, Evelyn." She held her coffee with both hands and watched him leave. The elevator opened. It shuddered. It closed. She sat alone in 4,000 square feet of silence and finished her coffee. Then she picked up the pen. She signed her name. She signed it clearly, without hesitation, in the same careful hand she'd used to sign contracts worth 8 figures, to authorize transfers, to co-sign the documents that had quietly restructured Roman Voss's family operation into something that could stand in daylight. She'd signed her name on a lot of things in 4 years. She signed it now and set the pen down and slid the papers aside. She had a 9 o'clock meeting. The building where Evelyn rented a small office was in Midtown, a 15-floor commercial tower that smelled of recycled air and old carpet, and wasn't the kind of address Roman would have tolerated for himself. She'd taken the space 8 months ago, quietly, on her own. 1,200 square feet on the 9th floor with a view of a parking structure and enough quiet to think. She'd told Roman it was a project management base for a philanthropic initiative she was exploring. That was partially true. The other part she kept to herself. Her assistant, a 24-year-old named Dana with a precise mind and the useful social skill of being easy to underestimate, was already at her desk when Evelyn arrived. "The Harmon Group confirmed for 10:30, Dana said, standing and following Evelyn into the inner office with a tablet. "Westfield pushed to Thursday, and you have 3 calls from someone named," she checked, "Garrett Lowe, Celestia International's Director of Talent Partnerships." Evelyn set her bag on the desk. "How many times did he call?" 3. Over 2 days. He left a message the 3rd time. "What did he say?" "That it was time sensitive and that he'd prefer a direct conversation." Dana paused. "He also said, and I'm quoting, that they'd been watching you for a while." Evelyn sat down. The window behind her desk looked at a brick wall, and she'd never bothered to complain about it. She'd learned to work in whatever space she had. She pulled her laptop open and thought for a moment about Celestia International, a luxury fashion and lifestyle conglomerate, European-founded, American-expanded, with the kind of cultural reach that made other brands slightly envious and deeply imitative. She knew their market positioning. She'd done a case study on their consumer strategy 2 years ago as part of a project Roman never knew she'd been working on. "Call him back at 11, she said. "After Harmon." Dana made a note. "Also." A slight hesitation. "There's something you should probably see." She held out the tablet. On the screen was an image. Evelyn recognized it immediately. A photograph taken 3 weeks ago at the Brightside Youth Center in Brooklyn, where she'd been volunteering every other Saturday for the past year. She'd been helping a 7-year-old named Cora finish a collage, leaning over the table with a glue stick, completely absorbed, not looking at anything except the project in front of them. The girl had been so serious about it. Evelyn remembered laughing at something Cora said. A volunteer coordinator had posted the photo on the center's social media. Just a caption about a good morning and grateful hearts. Somehow, in 3 weeks, it had accumulated 400,000 shares. Evelyn looked at the numbers on the screen without expression. "The Vogue account reposted it yesterday," Dana said carefully. "And there are a lot of comments." "What kind?" Dana hesitated. "The good kind. People saying you look like, I don't know, real. That's the word they keep using. Real." Evelyn handed the tablet back. She thought about the photograph, the glue stick, the girl's small hands, the light in that room on a Saturday morning when the rest of her life had been quietly collapsing. She hadn't been performing anything. She'd just been there. "Set the low call for 11, she said, and opened her email. The Harmon Group meeting was about capital. Specifically, a private equity consortium interested in funding what Evelyn had spent 8 months building in careful, deliberate silence. a portfolio of interlocking ventures that were, on their surface, unrelated. A minority stake in a sustainable textile manufacturer in North Carolina, a co-investment position in a Brooklyn-based financial literacy nonprofit, a consulting arrangement with 3 mid-sized companies that were trying to restructure their public-facing operations. On their surface, unrelated. Underneath, they were the architecture of something larger, a platform, a foundation. Her name on things that were hers. She'd started planning it 2 years ago, before she knew about Victoria Hale, before the marriage had made its specific kind of rot visible. She'd started planning it because she was 32 years old, and she'd spent 4 years being brilliant in a room where only one person got credit. And some part of her had understood, even then, that this arrangement had a shelf life. The Harmon meeting went well. These things went well when you knew exactly what you were walking in with. Evelyn had learned, working alongside Roman, that the most important thing in a room full of capital was absolute clarity about your own value. Not performed confidence, not theater, but the genuine arithmetic of what you brought and what you were asking for. Roman had taught her that without meaning to. He'd taught her a lot of things without meaning to. After Harmon, she called Garrett low. He picked up on the first ring. "Ms. Sterling." His voice was the voice of someone who'd been in brand consulting long enough to make warmth feel like a professional skill. "Thank you for getting back to me. Your message said time sensitive." "It is. I'll be direct. We've been following the photograph from the Brooklyn Center, and the response has been significant enough that our creative director wants to have a conversation. Celestia is in the middle of repositioning its American Identity campaign, and the direction we're moving is authenticity. Not the performance of it, the actual thing." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "What does that mean in practical terms?" "It means we want someone whose image resonates with people who are tired of being sold to. The numbers around that photograph, we've had campaigns with 7-figure budgets that didn't move like that." A pause. "We're not talking about a short-term contract, we're talking about a partnership. Brand ambassador, co-creative involvement in the American campaign, potential equity participation in the U.S. arm." She looked at the brick wall outside her window. "Send me the term sheet," she said. She did not tell Roman. There was nothing, legally or practically, that required her to. The divorce papers were signed. The prenuptial agreement was clean. Her ventures had been structured carefully enough that they existed entirely outside the Voss financial architecture, a deliberate choice she'd made without fully articulating to herself why, until now. She did not tell him because he would not have understood. Not maliciously. Roman wasn't a man of malice, exactly. He was a man of certainty. He had decided, somewhere in the past year, that Evelyn was a particular kind of woman, steady, capable, quietly devoted, but fundamentally limited, an excellent support structure, not a center of gravity. He had decided this while she was doing the work. That was the thing she kept returning to in the weeks that followed. Not with bitterness, but with a cold fascination, the way you might study a mechanism that failed. Roman had watched her build things for 4 years and had categorized those things as extensions of himself. Not because he was a bad man exactly, because he'd never had to look at her as a separate entity. She'd made it easy. She'd made herself easy, making herself available, making herself useful, making herself the architecture of his success, while keeping her own name off the blueprints. That was her fault too. She was honest enough to admit it. But fault was a different thing from consequence, and she was done confusing the two. Victoria Hale came into Roman's life with the precision of something engineered. Evelyn had seen her for the first time 8 months ago, at a benefit gala in Tribeca that Roman had attended with the kind of social obligation he usually tolerated rather than enjoyed. Evelyn had been there too, standing beside him in a navy dress, watching him watch the room, and then watching him watch Victoria. Victoria was stunning in the way that requires infrastructure. Tall, composed, dressed in something that probably had a waiting list, moving through the room with the particular ease of a woman who understood that she was the point of any space she occupied. She was 34. She had a name in philanthropic circles and an apartment on the Upper East Side, and a way of laughing that made the person she was laughing with feel like they'd accomplished something. She'd gotten to Roman through flattery, which was the only entrance he'd ever really left open. Roman was a man who'd built his identity around being feared and respected, which meant admiration hit him differently than it hit other people. It went in deeper. Victoria understood this without being told. She had the instinct for it. She praised his judgment. She deferred to his knowledge. She made him feel, in the specific way that only certain kinds of attention can manufacture, that he had outgrown everything around him, including his wife. Evelyn had watched it happen the way you watch weather move in from a distance, not with surprise, but with a kind of tired recognition. She'd known. She'd known for months before Roman said anything, before he became distant, before the dinner stopped and the conversations narrowed and the space between them in the bed got wide enough to feel architectural. She'd known, and she hadn't fought it, and she'd spent a long time afterward wondering what that said about her. Then she'd stopped wondering and started working. She moved out of the penthouse on a Wednesday in February, 3 weeks after signing the papers. She'd arranged it deliberately for a day Roman had a full schedule, 3 meetings, a lunch, a site visit in New Jersey. She wasn't trying to avoid confrontation. She simply didn't want an audience for something that was private. The movers were efficient. She'd already sorted everything. Her things were her things, clearly delineated, no gray areas. She took her books. She took the small painting she'd bought at a street fair in the West Village before she'd ever met Roman, a watercolor of the Manhattan Bridge at a specific hour that she'd always liked. She took the coffee grinder. She took the box of files she kept in the home office, which contained, among other things, 4 years of strategic documents, financial analyses, market studies, and expansion proposals, all in her handwriting, all undated in a way that would now matter. She did not take the pen he'd left on the divorce papers. She left it on the kitchen counter. She moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in the West Village on the 4th floor of a narrow building on a street where the trees were old enough to have opinions. It was a fraction of the size of the penthouse. The ceilings were lower. The elevator was slow. She liked it immediately. Dana came over that first evening with Thai food and a bottle of wine and the professional discretion to not ask anything Evelyn didn't volunteer. The Celestia term sheet came in, Dana said, around 10 o'clock, when they were sitting on the floor because the furniture hadn't arrived yet. And? It's very good, Dana paused. It's actually kind of remarkable. Evelyn looked at her. Equity stake in the U.S. arm. Creative partnership. 3-year minimum with renewal options. And the first campaign activates in 45 days. Dana set the printed document on the floor between them. They want to announce in April. April was 3 months away. Evelyn did the math without meaning to. By April, the divorce would be finalized. By April, whatever she was building would have its first public face. She picked up the term sheet and read it carefully, the way she read everything. Then she said, I want one change in the equity clause. Dana smiled. I'll mark it up in the morning. Chomta. Roman found out about Victoria leaving 7 weeks later. Evelyn didn't learn this from him. She learned it from a mutual contact, a woman named Sylvia Chen, an attorney who occupied the overlapping social world where Roman's business life and New York's legitimate power structure had always carefully coexisted. Sylvia was not a gossip. She delivered information the way a pharmacist delivers medication. Here's what you need to know. The dosage is your business. She ended it at dinner, Sylvia said, over coffee, in a place in the Flatiron district where neither of them would run into anyone Roman knew well. From what I understand, she was fairly direct about her reasons. What were they? Sylvia wrapped both hands around her cup. She told him she needed to be with someone whose future was still moving upward. Evelyn sat with that for a moment. The phrase had a specific geometry to it. He didn't see it coming, Sylvia added. He never does, Evelyn said, not unkindly, as plain fact. She drove home through the February cold thinking about that sentence, whose future is still moving upward, and about the coffee shop on Bleecker Street where she and Roman used to work on Saturday mornings in the early days, before the business got big enough to need offices, before success calcified into something Roman could no longer interrogate. They'd sat across from each other at a small table and she'd drawn diagrams on the backs of napkins, and he'd pushed her ideas further and she'd pushed back, and the collaboration had been real then, combustible. 2 people building something together in the particular heat of genuine partnership. She didn't know exactly when he'd stopped thinking of it as a collaboration. She knew when she'd stopped pretending it still was. The Celestia campaign shot in March. The photographer was a woman named Iris Park, whose work Evelyn had admired for years without expecting to be on the other side of a lens from. They shot in a series of locations across the city, A community garden in the Bronx, a library in Harlem, the rooftop of a building in Sunset Park with the whole Manhattan skyline at midday. The brief was authenticity, which in practice meant that Iris worked the way a documentary filmmaker works. Ambient light, real spaces. No one telling Evelyn where to put her hands. It was the strangest professional experience she'd had. She kept expecting to feel like a fraud and didn't. She stood in those spaces and thought about the work, the foundation, the investments, the structures she was building, and apparently that was what showed on her face, because Iris kept making a sound of quiet satisfaction and not adjusting anything. "You're not performing," Iris said between setups, eating a sandwich on the rooftop. "Is that a problem?" "It's the only reason we're here." Iris looked out at the skyline. "You know how many times I've shot people who've been told to perform naturalness? It reads as desperation. You look like someone with somewhere to be." Evelyn thought about that. "I do have somewhere to be." "That's what I mean." The campaign launched in April, 3 days after her divorce was finalized. The billboards went up overnight. She knew they were going up. She'd signed off on every placement. But she hadn't anticipated what it would feel like to turn a corner in her own city and see her own face 50 feet tall, calm and without apology, her name underneath in clean white letters. She stopped on the sidewalk for a moment on a cold April morning and looked at it. A woman next to her stopped too and then looked at Evelyn standing there. "That's you," the woman said. "Yes," Evelyn said. "You look like someone who knows something." Evelyn started walking again. "I'm working on it," she said. Roman saw the billboard from his car on a Tuesday morning in April, stopped at a red light on 6th Avenue. She knew this not because she was watching for it, but because the driver who'd worked for Roman for 6 years, a quiet man named Marcus who had always been kind to Evelyn in the way that good people are kind without making it complicated, called Dana's personal number that afternoon. "He stopped in the middle of traffic," Marcus said, horns going. He didn't move for like 30 seconds. Just sat there looking at the board. Dana relayed this without commentary. Evelyn was at her desk reviewing Q2 projections when she heard it. She was quiet for a moment. She didn't feel the satisfaction she'd once imagined she might feel. She felt something more complicated and less dramatic, a kind of grief, maybe, for the version of him that could have seen her when she was standing right in front of him, and didn't. She went back to the projections. Outside her window, the brick wall was the same brick wall it had always been. The city moved below it without asking anyone's permission. She had a 4 o'clock call with the Foundation's legal team about the incorporation documents, and a dinner at 7 with 2 of the Harmon Group partners. And somewhere between those 2 appointments, she was going to make a decision about the North Carolina textile deal that had been sitting on her desk for 10 days, waiting for her to stop hedging. She stopped hedging. She picked up the phone and called the manufacturer's representative in Durham and said plainly that they had a deal. Then she went back to the projections. She had a lot of work left to do. 3 weeks later, Evelyn was standing in the lobby of a building in downtown Manhattan, the kind of building whose lobby says money the way a church says silence, waiting for an elevator, when she heard her name. She turned. Roman Voss was standing 15 feet away. He looked like himself, impeccably dressed, physically composed, the surface of him as polished as it had always been. But there was something different underneath it, something she might have missed if she hadn't spent 4 years learning the architecture of his particular kind of control. He looked like a man who had recently revised a belief he'd held for a long time and was still deciding what to replace it with. They stood looking at each other across the marble lobby of an expensive building in the middle of a weekday, surrounded by people moving through on their own business. "Evelyn," he said again. Not a question, just her name. "Roman," she said. He walked toward her. She didn't move. He stopped at a conversational distance, not close, not performatively distant, and looked at her with the expression she'd been seeing more of lately on the faces of people who'd underestimated her. Not embarrassment exactly, something harder to name than that. "The campaign looks good," he said. "Thank you. Celestia's a serious organization." "I know." A beat. He looked like he wanted to say something specific and was routing around the edges of it. "I've been reading about the foundation," he said. "The Sterling Foundation." She waited. "It looks like significant work." "It is." Another beat. The elevator behind her opened. Neither of them moved. "I didn't know," he said, "about a lot of things. She looked at him steadily. The lobby moved around them. She thought about the napkins in the coffee shop, the nights in the apartment on Riverside Drive before they'd had enough money for the penthouse, when they were both running on coffee and shared ambition and the genuine feeling that they were building something together. She thought about signing the divorce papers at 6 in the morning with both hands around a coffee mug while he moved through the kitchen like she wasn't there. "I know you didn't," she said. The elevator doors closed behind her. She turned around, pressed the button, and waited for the next one. When she glanced back, Roman was still standing there, looking at the space where she'd been, with the expression of a man beginning to do a very specific and very painful kind of math. The elevator opened. She stepped in. The doors closed. And in her pocket, her phone buzzed twice. A message from Dana. 2 words. He called. Evelyn looked at the elevator doors. She put her phone back in her pocket. The elevator rose. The message from Dana said 2 words. He called. Evelyn read it again in the elevator, standing alone in the mirrored box rising through the building's core, the city dropping away below her floor by floor. She looked at her own reflection, composed, unhurried, the kind of stillness that costs something to maintain, and thought about what Roman calling meant, and what it didn't mean, and what she was going to do about it either way. She put the phone in her bag. What she was going to do about it was nothing, not from anger, not from strategy exactly, though there was an element of that she was honest enough to acknowledge. She was going to do nothing about it because she was in the middle of something that required her complete attention, and Roman Voss was no longer in the category of things that required her complete attention. He had been for 4 years. He had occupied the center of her professional and personal life with the natural gravitational pull of a man who expected to be the center of things and was rarely disappointed. She had let him. She had organized her intelligence and her energy and her ambition around the axis of his success, and she had done it willingly, which meant the reckoning was partly hers to own. She owned it. And then she walked into the 42nd floor conference room and shook hands with the 3 Westfield partners who'd been waiting 12 minutes, and for the next 2 hours she was completely, surgically present. Dana was waiting when she came out. They walked to the elevator together, Dana matching her pace, tablet in hand, the professional shorthand of 2 people who developed a working language over 8 months of building something from scratch. "He called the main line," Dana said, "not your cell. He left a message with the answering service." "What did it say?" "That he'd like to speak with you when you have time, that it wasn't urgent." A pause. "He said, please." Evelyn pressed the elevator button. "Note it and file it." "That's it?" "That's it." Dana made the note. The elevator opened. They stepped in. "The Harmon partners want to move the Thursday dinner to Friday," Dana said, and Iris Park sent over the final selects from the rooftop shoot. She flagged 3 she thinks should replace the current Times Square rotation in June. "Send them to my personal email tonight. I'll look at them before I sleep." Also, Dana hesitated in the particular way she hesitated when something was personally adjacent rather than professionally clean. A journalist from the Times called. Lifestyle section. They want to do a profile. Evelyn looked at the elevator doors. On what angle? They said. Dana checked her notes. The woman behind the Celestia campaign and what she built before anyone was watching. The doors opened. They stepped out into the lobby. Evelyn thought about that phrase, what she built before anyone was watching, and felt the particular discomfort of something true being said out loud by someone who didn't fully understand what they were saying. "Tell them I'll consider it," she said. "Not yet." Roman called again on Thursday. This time, he called her cell. She was in a car headed uptown, going over the Foundation's program proposal, a 40-page document she'd read 3 times and was reading a 4th time because there was a structural issue in Section 7 that everyone else seemed to have missed, and she hadn't been able to name precisely until now. The phone buzzed in her hand. His name on the screen. She watched it buzz 3 times. Then it stopped. Then, 20 seconds later, a text. "I know you're busy. I just want to talk. Not about anything legal. Just talk." She looked at it for a long time. The car moved through Thursday Midtown traffic, stop and go, the city doing what the city did. She thought about the lobby that morning, the expression on his face, the specific quality of a man doing painful math. She thought about what talk meant when Roman said it. Roman, who had always been better at silence and action than at the kind of conversation that required him to be uncertain. She thought about what she might feel, sitting across from him, whether she trusted herself to feel it without letting it cost her something. She put the phone face down on the seat beside her. Section 7 had a problem in the budget allocation framework. She found it on the fourth read. She circled it in red and wrote a note in the margin in the handwriting that had always been too small, too precise, the handwriting of someone who filled margins. She did not text Roman back. The call she was not prepared for came on Friday evening, from a number she didn't recognize. A 212 area code, landline prefix, the kind of number that belonged to a law firm or a private club. She answered, "Ms. Sterling," a man's voice, professional, not warm. "My name is Arthur Crane. I'm an attorney. I represent several former executives of Voss Capital Holdings." A pause. "I apologize for the direct contact. I was given your personal number by someone who believed you'd want to hear what I have to say." Evelyn was standing in her kitchen, having just gotten home, still in her coat. She didn't move. "I'm listening," she said. "My clients are in the process of preparing a formal disclosure regarding certain internal business practices at Voss Capital, specifically regarding the attribution of strategic development work between 2019 and 2023. He paused again, carefully. "Your name appears in a significant number of the internal documents we've reviewed." She set her bag on the counter, very slowly. "What kind of documents?" she said. "Proposals? Strategic memos? Expansion frameworks? The kind of foundational work that—" a deliberate pause. "Appears to have been presented externally under a different name." Evelyn stood in her kitchen, in her coat, and thought about 4 years of Saturday mornings and late nights, and documents she'd drafted and handed across a desk to a man who took them into rooms she wasn't invited into. She thought about the expansion model, the investment structure, the corporate transition plan. She thought about the number of times she'd watched Roman receive credit for something she'd built and had chosen, consciously, to let it pass because she'd told herself it didn't matter. The work mattered. The building mattered. The shared project mattered. She thought about how long she'd believed that. "What are your clients looking for?" she said. Her voice was completely level. "Documentation, corroboration, and frankly," another pause, "your account." "I'll have my attorney contact you Monday morning," she said. "Of course. I appreciate your—" She ended the call. She stood in her kitchen for a moment, perfectly still in her coat, her hand around the phone. The apartment was quiet. The street outside made its Friday evening sounds. Voices, a car, something distant and ordinary. Then she took her coat off, hung it up, and called her attorney. Her attorney was a woman named Patricia Osai, 52, meticulous, with the quality Evelyn valued most in legal counsel. She didn't editorialize. She listened to the summary of Arthur Crane's call without interrupting and then was quiet for 4 seconds, which in Patricia's case meant she was sorting. "Do you have documentation?" Patricia asked. "Your own copies, independent of anything currently in the Voss corporate system." "Yes." "All of it?" "Enough of it." Another 4-second pause. "Evelyn, when I say all of it, I have the originals of 14 strategic documents created between 2019 and 2022. I have my own drafts, with my own dates and my own handwriting, of the expansion framework and the investment restructuring proposal. I have email correspondence." She paused. "I kept copies of everything I built." Patricia was quiet in a different way. "You knew this might happen," Patricia said. "I knew it was possible," Evelyn said. "I didn't know who would pull the thread." "All right." Patricia's voice shifted into its working register, the one that meant she was already 3 steps ahead and needed Evelyn to keep up. "Don't speak to Crane again without me. Don't speak to Roman. Don't say anything to anyone about this. Not Dana, not the Celestia people, no one, until we understand what his clients are actually building and what they want from you specifically." "Understood." And Evelyn, a beat. "This is going to get complicated." "I know," Evelyn said. It already was. Roman found out about Arthur Crane on Saturday. She knew this because he showed up at her building. She was coming back from a run, 6 blocks, the way she always ran when something was pressing, not for distance, but for the physical fact of movement, her breath loud in her own ears, and the cold April air doing what cold air does when you need it to cut through something. She turned the corner onto her street, and he was standing outside her building in a dark coat, hands in his pockets, and the sight of him there, Roman Voss, standing on a West Village sidewalk outside her building on a Saturday morning, hit her with a physical jolt she refused to let reach her face. She walked the last 20 feet at the same pace and stopped in front of him. They looked at each other. His jaw was tight. His eyes had the quality she recognized from the rare moments when his certainty had cracked slightly. Not open, not vulnerable, but pressurized. A man containing something he hadn't decided how to release. "You could have called," she said. "You don't answer." She took a breath. Her heart was still elevated from the run. "Roman, Crane contacted you," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." His jaw moved. "Those men aren't... They have their own agenda here. They're not doing this for you." "I know that. They're going to use you to get to me, and when they're done, they're going to..." "Roman." Her voice was quiet and flat, and it stopped him. "I'm aware of how this works. I've been watching you operate for 4 years. He looked at her. The morning moved around them. A dog walker, a delivery cyclist, a couple pushing a stroller past at the exact wrong or right moment, ordinary Saturday life refusing to accommodate the scene. "I need to know what you're going to do," he said. "I'm going to talk to my attorney. And then? And then I'm going to make a decision that's right for me." She held his gaze. "That's all I can tell you right now." Something moved through his face. Not anger. Something underneath anger, the substrate of it. She thought she recognized it, and then wasn't sure, and then was. It was fear. Roman Voss, standing on a West Village sidewalk at 9 in the morning, was afraid. Not of Crane's clients, not of the legal exposure. He was afraid of her, of what she knew, of what she held, of what 4 years of watching her work had actually added up to in the hands of someone who was no longer choosing silence. "The expansion model," he said, quietly, as if naming it made it smaller. "Yes," she said. "The investment restructuring. Yes." His breath came out slowly. He looked away down the street, at nothing, at the Saturday morning moving past, and she watched the side of his face, and thought about how long she'd spent watching that face and learning its angles, and it was strange how you could know someone's face better than almost anything, and still be standing outside in the cold talking to them like they were someone you'd once been in business with. "I didn't think of it as taking anything," he said, still not looking at her. "I know. I thought of it as ours." She looked at him. "But it wasn't presented as ours," she said. "Was it?" He didn't answer. The silence had its own weight. "Go home, Roman," she said. Not cruel, not gentle, just true. He turned back to look at her one more time, and she saw the specific architecture of a man confronting the thing he'd managed not to confront for years, the full shape of a cost he'd been paying in small increments without keeping the ledger. He turned and walked away. She watched him go. Then she went upstairs and showered and sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and a coffee and her phone face up, and she called Patricia. "Monday is too long," she said when Patricia answered. "I need to meet tomorrow." "Sunday?" A pause. "All right. My office, 10 a.m. Evelyn closed the laptop. Outside the window, the West Village was doing its Saturday things, the unhurried rhythm of a neighborhood that had always made its own rules about time. She'd chosen this apartment for that quality without fully knowing it. She'd needed to live somewhere that moved at a pace she could think inside of. She had a lot of thinking to do. She had the documentation. She had Patricia. She had a foundation in incorporation and a campaign on billboards and a textile deal closing in North Carolina and 3 investors who believed in what she was building. She also had, somewhere in her files, 14 original documents that could rewrite the public history of how the Voss Empire had become what it was. She had not decided what to do with them yet. She did not make decisions before she had enough information. But the decision was coming, moving toward her through the weekend like weather. And on the other side of it, she knew nothing was going to look the same as it had the week before. Her phone buzzed. Dana, the Times profile journalist, called again. She said she has a source, someone who used to work at Voss Capital. She said, Evelyn stared at the message. She said she already knows about the documents. She set the phone down. She looked at the window. The city outside was Saturday bright and completely indifferent, the way cities are, moving through its own enormous business without. The Times journalist's name was Claire Novak. Evelyn found this out Sunday morning, sitting in Patricia's office on the 31st floor of a building in Midtown, where the Sunday quiet made the whole space feel pressurized, like a room that knew it wasn't supposed to be occupied. Patricia had coffee waiting and a legal pad already half covered in her small, angular handwriting, and she did not waste time on preamble. Claire Novak has been covering corporate accountability for the Times for 6 years, Patricia said, sitting across from Evelyn with her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She broke the Hardin Capital story in 2021. She is not a lifestyle journalist. Evelyn set down her coffee. Dana said she called the lifestyle section.
She used the lifestyle section as a door. Patricia turned the legal pad around so Evelyn could see it. She has a source inside Voss Capital, someone who left in 2022. From what I've been able to piece together in the last 18 hours, this person has been talking to Crane's clients and to Novak simultaneously. She tapped the pad. They've been coordinating. Evelyn looked at the name Patricia had circled at the bottom of the page.
Marcus Webb, former Chief Operating Officer, Voss Capital Holdings, departed, officially, for personal reasons, in March 2022. She knew the name. She knew the man, mid-50s, lean, precise, the kind of operational mind that ran on systems and resented chaos. He'd been good at his job. He'd also been in the room for most of the meetings where Roman had presented her work as his own. He was there, Evelyn said, for almost all of it, from what I can tell. Patricia took her glasses off entirely and set them on the desk. Evelyn, I need you to understand what's actually happening here. Crane's clients aren't primarily interested in you. They're building a case against Roman, specifically against the way Voss Capital was structured and how credit was attributed during the expansion period. You are material witness territory. Your documents are evidence. She paused. But Novak is a different animal. Novak is interested in the story, and the story, the way she appears to be framing it, is not about Roman. It's about me, Evelyn said. It's about what was done to you, and what you built anyway. Patricia held her gaze, which means she needs you to participate. She can't tell that story without your voice. Evelyn sat with that. The Sunday city moved outside the windows, sparse and gray, the weekend version of itself. She thought about what it meant to have your story told by someone else. The particular helplessness of that, the way a narrative could be technically accurate and still feel like a violation of something private. What does she know specifically? Evelyn asked. She knows about the 14 documents. She knows they exist and that they predate Roman's public presentations of the same strategies. She knows your name is on the originals. Patricia paused. She also knows about the Celestia campaign and the Foundation. She's framing it as a redemption arc. I don't need a redemption arc, Evelyn said. I wasn't the one who did something wrong. I know that. You know that. Patricia looked at her steadily. But the way she tells it, the wronged woman rising, that's the version that gets published. That's the version that goes everywhere. She picked up her pen. The question is whether you control how it's told or whether Claire Novak controls it for you. Evelyn looked at the circled name on the legal pad, Marcus Webb. She thought about what it meant that he'd been sitting on this for 2 years and had chosen now to move. Not when she was still inside the Voss architecture. Not when she was invisible. Now, when her face was on billboards, when the Foundation was incorporating, when she had enough momentum that her version of events would land differently than it would have 18 months ago. He'd waited until her credibility was established. She wasn't sure if that was calculated or simply patient. Either way, it had a coldness to it she hadn't anticipated from the man she remembered as orderly and methodical rather than strategic in the political sense. I want to speak to Webb directly, she said. Patricia was quiet for a moment. That's not standard. I know it's not standard. I want to do it anyway, before I make any decision about Crane or Novak. She looked at Patricia. Can you arrange it? Patricia put her glasses back on, picked up her pen. I'll try for Tuesday. Coach. She spent Sunday afternoon at the Foundation offices, alone, which was how she preferred to work when something needed thinking through without interruption. The Foundation space was 3 rooms on the 2nd floor of a building in Chelsea. Not grand, deliberately not grand, because she'd watched Roman confuse the performance of power with its substance for long enough to have strong feelings about the difference. The walls were painted a clean off-white. There were windows. There was a long table covered in documents and a whiteboard with a project timeline and a small kitchen where she kept good coffee because she spent enough time there to make it worth it. She made coffee. She stood at the whiteboard and looked at the timeline. The foundation was 6 weeks from its public launch. The Celestia campaign had 4 months left on its first activation cycle, with options already discussed for renewal. The North Carolina deal had closed on Friday. The Harmon Group's capital commitment was contingent on the foundation's incorporation going smoothly. Everything was moving. Everything was in motion, properly sequenced, the way she'd designed it. And now there was a journalist and a former COO and a law firm full of disgruntled ex-Voss employees pulling at threads she hadn't anticipated from this direction. She had the documents. That was still true. She had the originals, time-stamped by her own system, corroborated by her drafts, her handwriting, her email trail. The evidence of what she'd built was not in question. What was in question was what happened to her foundation, her investors, her Celestia partnership, when her name got attached to a corporate lawsuit against her ex-husband. What happened to the women she was trying to reach through the Sterling Foundation when the first thing those women saw when they searched her name was litigation? What happened to the image Iris Park had spent 3 weeks carefully building? Real, unperformed, a woman with somewhere to be, when it got flattened into the story of a wronged ex-wife. She didn't sleep much Sunday night. Marcus Webb met her in a coffee shop in Murray Hill on Tuesday morning at her request and through Patricia's arrangement. He was already there when she arrived, sitting at a corner table with his hands around a cup, looking like what he was, a man who had spent 30 years in rooms where decisions got made and had developed the stillness of someone accustomed to waiting. He stood when he saw her, old professional reflex. She sat across from him without ceremony. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, two people who had occupied the same ecosystem for 3 years without ever sitting directly across from each other like this. "You look well," he said. "Tell me what you have," she said. He blinked. Then he sat back slightly, and something in his posture recalibrated. Not offended, just adjusting to her register. "All right," he said. He had emails. 14 months of internal communications in which Roman had forwarded her documents, her proposals, her frameworks, her strategic analyses to board members, investors, and external partners with his own name at the top and no attribution. He had meeting minutes in which her work was referenced as Roman's vision. He had a specific board presentation from October 2021 in which Roman had delivered, word for word, a restructuring proposal Evelyn had drafted in August of that year, in a document Webb himself had received from her directly when Roman had asked her to share it with operations. "I received your documents," Webb said. "I knew where they came from. I watched him present them." He wrapped both hands around his cup. "I said nothing at the time because I was employed by the man, and I had my own interests to protect. I am aware that is not admirable." "Why now?" she said. "Because Crane's clients approached me. And because—" he paused. "Because I watched the Celestia campaign launch, and I read the foundation materials, and I thought about what that work actually cost you. And I'm 60 years old, and I'm tired of protecting arrangements that were wrong." She looked at him. She was trying to read whether this was genuine or whether the 60-year-old moral reckoning was a story he was telling himself over a more straightforward motive, the satisfaction of watching Roman Voss get dismantled by the evidence Webb had been sitting on for 2 years. She decided it was probably both. People were usually both. "What does Crane want?" she said. "Corroboration. The board presentation, with your original draft alongside it, makes the attribution case almost automatically. But his clients want testimony, someone who was in the room." "And Novak?" Webb was quiet for a moment. "Novak wants you," he said simply. "She wants the full story, not just the documents. She wants to know what it felt like to build something and watch someone else take credit for it for 4 years. He paused. "She told me," she said, "the documents are evidence of what he did. But only you can explain what it cost." Evelyn looked at her coffee. Her hands were on the table, still. "Did you tell her about the expansion model specifically?" she said. "Yes." "The investment restructuring proposal?" "Yes." "The corporate transition plan?" A slight pause. "Yes." She absorbed this.
She thought about the specific document he'd just confirmed, the corporate transition plan, which was the most consequential of the three, the blueprint that had allowed Roman to move Voss family operations from their underground architecture into a legitimate corporate structure without triggering regulatory scrutiny. It was sophisticated work. It had taken her 4 months.
Roman had presented it to his family's council in December 2020 as his own design, and it had been the moment, she understood now, when his standing in that room had shifted permanently. That document, attributed correctly, changed the story of the Voss Empire's transformation. That document, in the hands of a journalist or a law firm, was not just a career attribution question. It was something else entirely. "Marcus," she said quietly, "who else has seen the transition plan document specifically?" He met her eyes, and she saw it. A fraction of a second, a slight tightening at the corners. A man who had just realized she'd arrived at something faster than he'd expected. "Crane's lead attorney," he said, "and Novak." Evelyn sat very still. "They know what it is?" she said. "They know what it shows." She pushed her chair back and stood up. He looked up at her, uncertain for the first time since she'd sat down. "Tell Patricia I'll call her in an hour," she said. She walked out of the coffee shop into the Tuesday morning cold, and she made it half a block before she stopped on the sidewalk with her hand against the wall of a building and stood there, breath coming harder than she'd let it come in a very long time. The corporate transition plan. She had drafted it as a legitimate structural document, a legal, above-board restructuring framework. She had been careful. She had been precise. She had built it to move the Voss operation into daylight, not to document what had been in the dark, but she had drafted it with full knowledge of what was being restructured. She had known the origin of the capital. She had known the history of the family operation. She had built the bridge from there to here, and she had built it well. And Roman had taken the credit. But if Novak published that document, if it became public evidence in a lawsuit, it didn't just expose Roman's appropriation of her work. It exposed the nature of what the work had been done for. It exposed her knowledge, her 4 months of meticulous, deliberate, fully informed drafting on behalf of an organization whose history she had understood completely. She had never been charged with anything. She had never been near anything criminal directly. The document itself was clean, a legitimate restructuring plan. But the context, the timeline, her name on the original, now a matter of public record in a lawsuit, attached to the transition of a criminal enterprise, her foundation, her investors. Celestia. She stood on the sidewalk with her hand on cold brick and thought with absolute clarity about what was coming apart. She called Patricia. "I need you to listen to me very carefully," she said when Patricia picked up. "The transition plan document, if that goes into discovery, if it goes to Novak." "I know," Patricia said. And the way she said it, the quality of those 2 words, clipped and already moving, told Evelyn that Patricia had gotten there before her. "I've been sitting here since Sunday trying to find the right moment to tell you." Evelyn closed her eyes. The traffic moved past her. The city moved past her, enormous and indifferent. "How bad?" she said. Patricia was quiet for 3 seconds. "If it goes public the wrong way, everything you've built in the last 8 months becomes a story about someone with undisclosed connections to a criminal restructuring. The foundation loses its donors. Celestia invokes the morality clause in your contract. The Harmon Group pulls the capital commitment." A pause. "You'd be starting over, from a much worse position than before." Evelyn opened her eyes. She looked at the street. At the ordinary Tuesday morning moving past her, people going to work, a kid on a skateboard, a woman arguing quietly on her phone, the whole enormous ordinary machinery of the city that didn't know and didn't care that her carefully constructed future had just developed a fault line she hadn't seen coming. "Crane's clients," she said. "They know about the morality clause risk?" "They're the ones who found it," Patricia said. "Evelyn, I think they're going to use the document not to help you. I think they're going to use it as leverage. Against Roman, yes, but also against me," Evelyn said. "They need you cooperative. If you're cooperative, the document stays in discovery and out of Novak's story. If you're not," she understood. She had been so careful. She had built everything so carefully, sequenced it, protected it, structured it outside the Voss architecture specifically so it could stand independent of whatever happened to Roman. She had been meticulous. And the one thing she hadn't been able to fully separate from was the thing she'd built with her own hands in the winter of 2020 at a kitchen table in a penthouse 40 stories above Manhattan, while Roman sat across from her and told her she was brilliant, and she'd believed him, and she'd given him everything she had. She had 4 days before Crane's attorney expected a response. She had one option she hadn't considered yet, one move that required her to become something she'd never been, to operate in a register she'd always kept herself out of, to call in a debt from a person she hadn't spoken to in The person she hadn't spoken to in 2 years was a woman named Diane Cho. Evelyn made the call from her car, parked on a side street in Murray Hill, still half a block from the coffee shop where she'd left Marcus Webb, sitting with his cold cup and his 2-year-old conscience. Her hands were steady. Her voice, when Diane picked up on the third ring, was steady. The rest of her was doing something she didn't have a name for, not panic, something colder and more mechanical, the feeling of a structure under load. Evelyn Sterling, Diane said. Not surprised, which was itself information. You've been following the news, Evelyn said. I've been following you since the Celestia launch. Everyone has. A pause. The sound of a door closing, ambient noise cutting off. Diane moving somewhere private. That was also information. I wondered when you'd call. Diane Cho was 47 years old and ran a crisis communications firm that operated in the specific gray zone between public relations and something harder to categorize, the management of narratives that had gone, or were about to go, catastrophically wrong. She had worked for 3 Fortune 500 companies, 2 political figures, and one situation Evelyn knew about only in outline that had involved a federal investigation and a story that never got published. She charged accordingly. She and Evelyn had met through a mutual contact in 2021, had dinner twice, had found each other useful without becoming close. That was the nature of Diane's relationships. Usefulness was the currency. I have a problem, Evelyn said. Tell me the shape of it. Evelyn told her. Not everything. Not the full legal architecture, not Patricia's analysis, but the shape, the documents, the lawsuit, the journalist, the transition plan, the morality clause, the 4-day window before Crane's attorney wanted an answer. Diane was quiet through all of it. When Evelyn finished, she was quiet for another 10 seconds. The transition plan is the problem, Diane said. Yes. Not because of what it contains, because of what publishing it implies about your knowledge. Another pause. Novak's story, if it runs with that document, becomes a different story than the one she thinks she's writing. It becomes complicated. Complicated kills the clean narrative. Complicated makes your foundation donors nervous. A beat. You know what Crane's people are doing? Using me as a pressure point on Roman. They don't need you to testify. They need Roman to know you could. They're going to sit on the transition plan threat and use it to force a settlement. Your cooperation is the lever. Diane's voice was completely flat, clinical. The question is whether you let them use you or whether you move first. Moving first means what? It means you control the document before they do. You get ahead of the narrative, you go to Novak yourself, on your terms, and you give her the story she actually wants, which is not the lawsuit, not the litigation, not the criminal adjacent angle. The story she wants is you. What you built. What was taken. What you rebuilt. A pause. You strip the transition plan of its leverage by making it irrelevant to the story you're telling. How do I make it irrelevant? By being transparent about it on your terms, in the right context, before Crane's people can weaponize it. You acknowledge you drafted a restructuring document, you frame it as the work of a woman who was doing her job, who trusted the man she was married to, who had no reason at that time to believe her work would be misused. You get ahead of the implication. A beat. You make it a chapter in your story instead of a grenade in someone else's. Evelyn sat in the parked car. Outside, a woman walked past with 2 small children, one on each hand, moving at the negotiated pace of adults and small children everywhere. Tuesday morning. Ordinary life. If I go to Novak now, Evelyn said, Roman will know I moved before he did. Yes. He'll take that as a declaration. Yes, Diane said. Is it? Evelyn looked at the street. Call me tonight, she said. 8 o'clock. She started the car. She called Roman at noon. He picked up before the second ring, which told her he'd been waiting, which told her Webb had told him about the coffee shop meeting, which told her the Tuesday morning was moving faster than she'd planned for. "We need to meet," she said. "Today." A pause. "Where?" "The Bleecker Street place." The coffee shop. Their coffee shop, from the early days, which she was choosing deliberately because she wanted him off balance in a specific direction. Nostalgic rather than defensive. Nostalgia made people slow. 4 o'clock. Another pause, shorter. "All right." She hung up. She had 4 hours. She spent them at the foundation office, not working, sitting at the long table with the whiteboard timeline in front of her, and doing the thing she'd always been better at than almost anything, holding multiple outcomes in her head simultaneously and running them forward to their conclusions. It was the skill Roman had recognized early and had used without fully appreciating. It was the skill that had built the expansion model, the investment structure, the transition plan, the ability to see the whole board. She saw the whole board now. If she cooperated with Crane fully, the lawsuit moved forward, the transition plan entered discovery, the morality clause risk materialized, the foundation took collateral damage from the association, and she spent the next 18 months as a legal instrument in someone else's case. If she refused to cooperate, Crane's attorney released the transition plan document to Novak as leverage. The story ran without her voice. The narrative became whatever shape Novak and Webb built without her. And she spent the next 18 months reacting to a version of her own life she hadn't written. If she went to Novak first, on Diane's terms, she controlled the story, she framed the transition plan before it could be weaponized, she accepted the exposure in exchange for the ownership of the narrative. Roman would know she'd moved. Roman would understand she was no longer choosing silence. And if she went to Roman at 4 o'clock and told him what she was going to do before she did it, not to ask permission, not to negotiate, but to give him the one thing she'd always given him even when he hadn't deserved it, which was honesty. Then at minimum, she could look at herself afterward. She stared at the whiteboard. Then she picked up her phone and texted Diane. "Tonight, 8. I've decided." The Bleecker Street coffee shop was the same as it had always been. Cramped, warm, a specific smell of dark roast and old wood that she associated so completely with the early days that walking in still produced a physical response. Something in the chest, the involuntary recognition of a time when everything was still possible and nothing had been lost yet. Roman was already there. He'd taken the corner table, the one they'd always used, and he was sitting with his hands around a coffee and his coat still on, which meant he'd been there less than 5 minutes and hadn't decided yet whether he was staying. He looked up when she came in. She sat down across from him. A server came. She ordered coffee. They waited for it in a silence that was different from the lobby silence and different from the sidewalk silence. This one had more history in it, heavier, the kind of silence that accumulates over years in a shared space. "You met with Webb," Roman said. "Yes." His jaw worked. "He's not. Whatever he told you, his motives are not clean." "I know. He's been sitting on those emails for 2 years waiting for a moment that served him. This is that moment." He looked at her steadily. "He doesn't care what happens to you. He's using the documents to settle a score." "I know that too," Evelyn said. "Roman." She held his gaze. "I didn't come here to talk about Webb." He was quiet. "I'm going to speak to the Times journalist," she said. "Claire Novak. I'm going to give her the story on my terms before Crane's people control the framing." She kept her voice level, the same register she used for difficult conversations that required precision. "I'm telling you before I do it, because you deserve to know, not because I need your permission." Something moved through his face. Not anger yet. Something before anger, the intake of breath before the reaction. "Evelyn, the transition plan is going to come out," she said. "Either in Crane's lawsuit, or in Novak's story, or both. I cannot prevent that. What I can do is make sure my role in it is framed by me, in my words, in my context, before someone else does it for me." She paused. "My foundation does not survive 18 months of being a footnote in your litigation. And if you go to Novak, He stopped, recalibrated. His voice dropped. "What happens to the transition plan document when it goes public?" "That's your problem," she said.
not cruelly, factually. It has been your problem since December 2020 when you presented it to your family's council. I built a legitimate restructuring document. What you built with it, what it restructured, what that council knew or authorized, none of that is mine. His hands tightened around his cup. She watched them, the knuckles, the tension moving up through his forearms. Roman Voss, the most feared man on the East Coast, sitting in a coffee shop on Bleecker Street in a coat he hadn't taken off. And she could see every layer of him right now, the fear and the pride and the specific pain of a man who had dismissed someone's value and was now watching that dismissal come back as consequence. "You'd burn all of it," he said, low, almost quiet. "I'm not burning anything," she said. "I'm choosing my own survival over protecting your exposure. Those are different things. The transition plan in public record ties you to the work I did as your wife, in your home, at your request, with full confidence that I was building something legitimate." Her voice stayed even, but it had weight in it now, real weight, the kind that comes from 4 years of deciding not to say something and finally saying it. "I was building something legitimate, Roman. That is what I built. Whatever was underneath it, whatever history your family brought to that table, that was yours. I did the work I was asked to do by the man I was married to and trusted." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said finally, so quiet she almost didn't hear it. The coffee shop moved around them, 2 women at the next table laughing about something, the espresso machine screaming briefly, the door opening, cold air flooding in, closing again. "I know," he said again, and the second time it had something different in it. Not just acknowledgement, something raw, a man saying a thing he'd been not saying for a very long time. She looked at him. She thought about the napkins and the early mornings and the version of him that had believed in the collaboration before success had made him certain he'd built it alone. She thought about the expression on his face in the lobby when she'd stepped into the elevator, and she thought about him standing outside her building on Saturday in a coat with his hands in his pockets, and she thought about 4 years of choosing his story over her own name. She didn't feel softness exactly. She felt something more complicated. The recognition of a real person inside the failure. He was both. Most people were both. "Then let me do this," she said. "Don't make it harder." His jaw was tight. His eyes were doing something she recognized from the early days, the look of a man who was thinking through a problem that had no clean solution and knew it. He'd always been better at problems with clean solutions. She'd been the one who could sit with the complicated ones. "There's something you don't know," he said. She went still. His hand moved to his jacket pocket. He hesitated. Then he put a folded document on the table between them. Just set it there, on the small cafe table between their coffee cups, in the warm, cramped space that smelled like the beginning of everything. She looked at it without touching it. "Crane's lead attorney," Roman said. "His name is David Park. Before he went to plaintiff's work, he spent 8 years at a firm that did defense work for my family." He paused. "He knows things about the transition period that have nothing to do with your documents. He is not using those documents to expose me." Roman's voice was flat now, stripped of the earlier layers. "He is using this lawsuit, using you, as leverage to get something else. Something he's been building toward for 3 years. Evelyn looked at the document. "What is that?" she said. "Open it." She unfolded it. It was 2 pages, dense text, a legal memorandum. She read it with the focused speed of someone who'd spent years reading documents that mattered. She got to the bottom of the first page and stopped. She read the paragraph again. David Park was not acting for his stated clients. The lawsuit was real, the clients were real, but Park had a secondary arrangement, documented in the memo in front of her, sourced from someone inside Park's own firm who had taken a significant personal risk to put it on paper, with a third party that had been trying to access specific Voss financial architecture for purposes that had nothing to do with justice or attribution and everything to do with leverage over a network that extended well past Roman and well past any civil litigation. If Park got the transition plan into public discovery, it wasn't to expose Roman, it was to expose the network the transition plan had restructured, to identify, publicly and irrevocably, the people who had authorized and benefited from that transition. People who were not Roman. People who were still operating. People who would respond to that exposure in ways that had nothing to do with courtrooms.
Evelyn set the document down. Her hands were flat on the table. She was aware of her own breathing, steady, deliberate, the run rhythm she used when she needed to keep herself from going somewhere she couldn't come back from. "Where did you get this?" she said. "Does it matter?" "Yes." He met her eyes. "Someone inside Park's firm who has their own reasons for not wanting this to proceed." A pause. "Someone who knows that if you go to Novak with the transition plan document and it enters the public record, the people whose names are attached to that restructuring are going to look for the person who made it possible to identify them." His voice was completely level now. "And your name is on the original." The coffee shop was warm. The women at the next table were still laughing. The espresso machine screamed again. Evelyn sat with what he'd just told her and felt it move through her like cold water. Not panic, but the physical sensation of a situation that had just become categorically different from what she'd understood it to be 20 minutes ago. She had been thinking about Celestia contracts and foundation donors and morality clauses. Roman was telling her this was something else. "How long have you known?" she said. 4 days. "You let me meet with Webb knowing this." "I didn't know you'd meet with Webb." His jaw tightened. "I found out about Webb and the Novak contact and Park's secondary arrangement almost simultaneously. I've spent 4 days trying to figure out how to—" He stopped. His hand was on the table, not reaching toward her, just there. "I didn't know how to come to you with this." She looked at him. "So you showed up at my building on Saturday," she said. "I was trying to—" "Yes," he exhaled. "I handled it badly." The understatement of it might have been funny under other circumstances. She didn't feel anything close to humor. She picked up the memo and read the critical paragraph one more time, making sure she had it exactly, her mind running the forward calculations already. What it meant, who it implicated, what happened to her. If the transition plan entered the public record in a lawsuit, controlled by a man with a secondary agenda that put her name in the crosshairs of people who operated in registers where civil litigation was not the primary tool of resolution. She set the memo down. "I need Patricia," she said. "I know. And you need to tell me everything, not the edited version." She looked at him directly, and something in her voice had shifted into a register she didn't use often. Not anger, not fear, something past both of those. The flat, hard clarity of someone who has just understood the full dimensions of a situation and is deciding how to move through it. Every name on that restructuring authorization, every person whose exposure this creates, all of it, tonight. Roman looked at her for a long moment. In 30 years of operating in rooms where men like him made decisions that couldn't be undone, she had never seen his face do what it did right now, which was, simply and without theater, go. Roman's face went open. That was the only word for it. 30 years of construction. The authority, the composure, the particular architecture of a man who had never allowed uncertainty to be visible. And it came down in a coffee shop on Bleecker Street on a Tuesday afternoon, between 2 cups of coffee that had gone cold, in front of the one person who had always known what was underneath it. He told her everything. He talked for 40 minutes, his voice low and even, the way men talk when they've decided to stop managing what they're saying and just say it. The names on the restructuring authorization. The 3 principals who had backed the Voss family operations transition into legitimate architecture and whose exposure the transition plan created. The nature of their relationship to David Park, which was older and more specific than a secondary legal arrangement. Park had worked adjacent to these men for a decade, had left on terms that weren't clean, and had been building toward this moment not out of justice, but out of a long-held debt of grievance that had nothing to do with Evelyn and would have consumed her anyway. She listened without interrupting. Her hands were flat on the table. Her coffee was cold. She listened the way she'd always listened, completely, without the kind of performative attention that signals processing rather than receiving, just taking it in, all of it, letting the whole shape of it assemble itself in her mind. When he finished, the coffee shop was quieter. The women at the next table had left. The afternoon light through the windows had shifted to the lower, grayer slant of 4:30 in late April. She said, "The 3 principals. Do they know about the lawsuit? They know about Crane's clients. They don't know about Park's secondary arrangement." A pause. "Or they didn't, as of 4 days ago." "Are they watching me?" Roman's jaw worked. "They're watching the lawsuit. Your name is in it. So yes." She absorbed this. "Patricia needs all of it. Tonight." I know. And Roman, she looked at him directly. If Patricia determines that the safest path forward requires you to take a specific action, legal disclosure, a proactive statement, anything, you do it without negotiation. He looked at her for a moment. In the old days, that kind of sentence from anyone would have produced a reaction. The authority of Roman Voss was not a thing that accepted directives. She watched him absorb it and watched him, slowly and without drama, nod. All right, he said. She picked up the memo from the table and folded it and put it in her bag. She left 2 20s on the table and stood up. He stood too. They faced each other in the cramped warmth of the coffee shop, in the place where they had built everything. In the specific air of a room that had absorbed 4 years of ambition and collaboration, and the particular energy of 2 people who had genuinely been something to each other before success had calcified it into something smaller and more damaging. She looked at him. I don't forgive you, she said, quietly, plainly. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time, but I understand how it happened. That's different. He held her gaze. His eyes had the quality she'd rarely seen in them. Not chastened, not defensive, just present, fully and without armor. It was the most honest she'd seen him in years. I know the difference, he said. She walked out. The April evening hit her. Cold. The particular cold of a city at dusk. The light going amber over the buildings and the streets filling with the end-of-day current of people moving toward whatever came next. She walked half a block and stopped and stood on the sidewalk and let herself feel, for exactly 60 seconds, the full weight of what the afternoon had been. The fear. The real fear, not the civilized anxiety of contracts and morality clauses, but the deeper, more animal fear of having her name attached to something that moved in directions she couldn't control, couldn't predict, couldn't structure her way out of. She let herself feel it because refusing to feel it would have been a lie, and she was done with certain kinds of lies. 60 seconds. Then she called Patricia. Patricia's office at 7 that evening had the quality of a room in which serious decisions were being made with inadequate information and insufficient time, which was, Patricia had once told her, the condition under which most serious decisions were actually made. Roman was there. He'd come without his own attorney, which was either trust or strategy or both. And Patricia had looked at him when he walked in with an expression that communicated clearly that his presence was being tolerated rather than welcomed, and that he should sit down and not speak until spoken to. He sat down. He didn't speak until spoken to. Patricia had the memo. She'd read it twice. She'd also, in the 3 hours between Evelyn's call and this meeting, made 4 phone calls of her own, to contacts in the federal system she didn't name and didn't need to. The kind of calls that cost favors accumulated over 25 years of working in the intersection of law and things adjacent to law. Park's secondary arrangement is real, Patricia said, standing at her desk rather than sitting, which was how she worked when she needed to stay sharp. And it's more serious than the memo suggests. The 3 principals, I won't use their names in this room, they'll be in the written documentation, have been under a parallel federal inquiry for 14 months. Not directly related to the Voss transition, related to subsequent activity. She looked at Evelyn. The transition plan, if it enters public discovery in Crane's lawsuit, doesn't just identify them. It gives the federal inquiry a timeline anchor they've been missing. Evelyn sat very still. Meaning the federal case gets stronger. Meaning the federal case potentially gets conclusive. Patricia paused. Which means these 3 people have an interest in preventing that document from entering the public record that is considerably more urgent than anything David Park has planned. Roman spoke. They'll move to suppress. They'll try, Patricia said, but that takes time, and it requires them to surface in a legal proceeding which they cannot afford. So before they do that, they'll try other methods. She looked at Evelyn. You understand what I'm saying? I understand, Evelyn said. I need to know, right now, what copies of the transition plan exist outside the Voss system. Who has them? Evelyn said, my original. Webb's copy from the internal email chain. Whatever Crane's attorney obtained through Webb. And whatever Novak has, which came from the same chain. Patricia looked at Roman. The internal server, Roman said. The original submission to the family council. 2 board member copies, both of whom are no longer involved. He paused. And a physical copy in a file at the penthouse. The penthouse is your current residence? Patricia asked. Yes. Patricia made a note. That copy needs to move tonight. Not destroyed, moved, somewhere that isn't your home address. She looked at them both. Here is what we're going to do. And when I say we, I mean all three of us, in coordination, executing this in a specific sequence that I'm going to outline. And no one deviates from the sequence without calling me first. She outlined it. It took 20 minutes, and when she was done, the room was quiet. And the way rooms get quiet, when a plan has been laid out that is neither comfortable nor clean, but is the best available option in a situation that had run out of comfortable, clean options. Evelyn looked at the window. Dark outside now, the city doing its evening thing, lit and moving and enormous. The foundation, she said. Protected if we move in the next 72 hours, Patricia said. The Celestia contract has a morality clause triggered by criminal association, not civil exposure. If we get ahead of this correctly, it doesn't trigger. A beat. But Evelyn, you need to call Diane Cho tonight, and you need to tell her the story has changed. The Times piece cannot run. Not now, not until the federal situation resolves. Novak won't accept that. Novak will accept a better story later over a blown story now. Give her exclusivity on the full account once the federal inquiry concludes. That's a front page, not a lifestyle section. She'll wait. Patricia looked at her steadily. You've spent 8 months building something real. Give it the protection it deserves. Evelyn looked at her hands on the table. The careful handwriting she'd always had. The margins full of notes. The 4 years of documents. Everything she'd built, and the cost of building it, and the cost of the silence, and the cost of the moment she'd finally stopped being silent. All right, she said. Mom. The next 72 hours moved the way crisis always moves when you're inside it. Simultaneously too fast and weirdly granular, every hour subdivided into specific actions, calls, decisions, the constant assessment and reassessment of a situation that kept revealing new surfaces. Patricia coordinated with the federal inquiry's supervising attorney through channels that Evelyn stayed deliberately ignorant of, which Patricia had been explicit about. There were things Evelyn did not need to know, and was better protected not knowing, and this was one of them. What Evelyn knew was that by Wednesday evening, the transition plan document had been formally provided to the federal inquiry directly, through Patricia, removing it from the civil lawsuit's discovery scope under a protective order that Park's legal maneuvering could not touch without surfacing the secondary arrangement and destroying his own position. Park's lawsuit did not collapse, but it lost its primary leverage. Crane's clients, presented with a case that had been structurally hollowed out, accepted a settlement with Voss Capital on Thursday that was financial rather than reputational. A significant payment, a formal acknowledgement of certain attribution failures in internal documentation, and a set of procedural reforms in how Voss Capital credited strategic contributions. Roman signed it without the negotiation he would once have insisted on. Evelyn was not a party to the settlement. Her name appeared in the internal documentation as the originating author of the disputed strategies. That was all. That was enough. Webb called her on Thursday evening. She let it go to voicemail. He said, carefully, that he was glad it had resolved and that he hoped she understood his motives. She listened to the message once. She didn't call back. She thought about what Diane had said, that most people are both things, the good motive and the self-serving one, and she thought about Webb sitting with his emails for 2 years, and she felt something that was not quite forgiveness and not quite contempt, but something in the honest territory between them. She deleted the voicemail. She called Diane at 9 on Thursday night. The story waits, she said. How long? I don't know. Months. Could be longer. A pause. Diane processed. I'll call Novak. Exclusivity commitment in writing. She'll be annoyed and she'll take it. Another pause. Evelyn, for what it's worth, you made the right calls. Under real pressure, with real stakes. That's not common. It costs things, Evelyn said. Everything costs things, Diane said. The question is whether you chose what to pay. You chose. She said goodnight and hung up. The Sterling Foundation launched publicly on a Saturday in late May, 6 weeks behind the original timeline, and without the feature profile in the Times, which had been quietly moved to a pending file that Claire Novak was, according to Diane, maintaining with professional patience and genuine interest. The launch was held in an event space in the meatpacking district. Not lavish, deliberately not lavish. A room that said we are here to work rather than to perform. 300 guests, donors, program partners, women from the Financial Literacy Initiative in Brooklyn who had come because they'd seen what the foundation was building and wanted to be part of the room where it was announced. Dana had coordinated the guest list with the precision she brought to everything, and standing behind the curtain before the program began, Evelyn could hear the specific frequency of the room, the sound of people who had gathered around something they actually believed in. She stood in a dark hallway with a glass of water and her own heartbeat, and the awareness that in 6 minutes she was going to walk out and say things she had been building toward for a long time. Patricia appeared beside her, looked at her, said nothing. She had the look of a woman who had spent a career in rooms before things happened and had developed an accurate read of the room. "You good?" Patricia asked. "Yes," Evelyn said, and she was. Not in the sense of easy or unburdened. Nothing was that. Nothing was resolved in the clean way that stories sometimes pretended things resolved. The federal inquiry was ongoing. The settlement had happened, but its aftermath was still settling. The three principals whose exposure she'd inadvertently become adjacent to were still present somewhere in the architecture of the world, operating in the registers they operated in. And she'd had the kind of phone call with Patricia 2 weeks ago that had clarified without drama that she should maintain certain personal security practices for the foreseeable future. She did. She was neither naive nor afraid. She was careful, which was different. The foundation was real. The Celestia partnership was intact. The North Carolina deal was running. The Harmon Capital was committed. The things she'd built were standing. They were standing because she'd built them right and because she'd made, under pressure, the specific choices that protected them. Not perfect choices, not clean choices, but hers. She walked out. The room settled. She stood at the podium and looked at 300 people who had shown up on a Saturday in May because something she'd built had given them a reason to. She didn't look at the back of the room until she was already speaking. When she did, she saw him, Roman, standing near the far wall, alone, in a dark suit, not part of the audience exactly, not trying to be, just present. She'd known he might come. She hadn't told him not to. She'd decided in the complicated accounting of what she owed him and what she didn't, that his presence at the thing she'd built was not a thing she needed to deny. He had information. He had moved when she needed him to move. Those were facts. They didn't rewrite the history, and they didn't require her to feel things she didn't feel. But they were facts. She looked away and kept speaking. "Someone once told me I wasn't the person they needed." The room was quiet. The specific quiet of people who recognize something true. For a while I believed them. Not because they were right, because when someone you've built your life around says something like that with enough certainty, the certainty transfers. You absorb it. You carry it around like it's yours. She paused. The Sterling Foundation exists because I decided to put that certainty down. She looked at the room. Not dramatically, not all at once. Incrementally, document by document, decision by decision, the way you actually build anything, slowly and in the dark, before anyone is watching. She paused. If you're in this room, you've done some version of that. You've carried something that wasn't yours and you've set it down, or you're in the process of setting it down, or you're here because you need to be in a room full of people who understand what that work costs. She let the silence hold for a moment. This foundation is that room. That's all it is. That's enough. The applause started before she'd fully finished the last sentence, the kind that comes from the chest rather than the hands, and she stood at the podium and received it without deflecting it, which she'd always had to consciously resist deflecting. The instinct to minimize, to redirect, to make herself smaller than the thing she'd built. She didn't deflect it. She let it land. Roman was waiting near the exit when the program ended, in the specific way of a man who wasn't expecting a conversation but wasn't leaving without making himself available for one. She walked toward him, not because she'd planned to, because it was the natural direction. They stood by the exit in the noise of the room wrapping up around them, people finding coats, saying goodbyes, the particular sound of an event ending well. "It was good," he said. His voice was quiet, not performing anything. "What you said, it was honest." "I know." He looked at the room. the investment framework, the expansion model. He said it simply, not as confession exactly, but as inventory, naming things accurately. I've been thinking about what it would have looked like if I'd done it right. If I'd put your name on it from the beginning. She considered this. Different, she said. I don't know in which directions. You'd have had everything you have now, sooner. Maybe. She thought about it genuinely, not to be generous, but because it was actually uncertain. Whether she would have built the foundation, whether she would have known she needed to build it, whether the discipline and the clarity she'd developed in the years of invisibility would have existed without those years. Or maybe I'd have been comfortable and not built anything at all. She paused. I don't know. I can't live in that version. He looked at her. No, he said. Neither can I. They stood for a moment in the noise of the room. She thought about the Bleecker Street coffee shop and the napkins and the early mornings. She thought about the penthouse at 6 a.m. and the divorce papers and the pen on the counter and the specific silence of a woman who'd already decided what came next. She thought about the fear in the parked car in Murray Hill and the memo on the table and 40 minutes of Roman Voss talking without managing what he said. She thought about Patricia's office and the 72 hours and the calculated decisions made under real pressure and the things that had been protected and the things that had been lost along the way and couldn't be recovered. She thought about the girl named Cora in a Brooklyn community center, serious over a collage, the glue stick, and the Saturday morning light, and how a stranger's camera had caught something unrepeatable in that moment and sent it out into the world, and how the world had recognized in it something it had been hungry for. She thought about standing outside her new building, looking at her own face 50 feet tall, and a woman next to her saying, "You look like someone who knows something." She thought about her own answer, "I'm working on it." "Take care of yourself, Roman," she said. He heard his own words from the January morning come back to him, and something in his face received them. Not as wound exactly, as completion, the closing of a specific loop. "You too," he said. She put on her coat. Dana appeared with her bag and her phone, professional and warm and entirely herself, the way she always was. They walked out together into the May evening, which was warmer than April, the city doing its Saturday night things, animated and loud and entirely indifferent to the fact that something had just ended and something else was already well underway. Wow. Summer came. The foundation ran its first full program cycle. 14 women from the Brooklyn Financial Literacy Initiative completed their certification. 3 of them launched small business applications within 6 weeks. The North Carolina Textile Partnership announced a second phase. Celestia's American campaign won 2 industry awards that Evelyn received at a dinner in September and placed when she got home on the kitchen counter of the West Village apartment without fanfare and went to bed. She didn't see Roman again until October, across a crowded room at an industry event she hadn't expected him to attend. They made brief eye contact. He nodded. She nodded. That was the whole of it. It was enough. Marcus Webb sent a letter in August. A physical letter, mailed, which she found both anachronistic and, once she'd read it, oddly appropriate. A man settling something that required the formality of paper. He acknowledged what he'd held and what he'd done with it and what he wished he'd done differently and asked for nothing in return. She read it twice, filed it, and wrote back a single paragraph that said she'd received it and that she wished him well and meant it. Claire Novak called in November to say that the federal inquiry had reached a conclusion that would become public in January, and that the terms of their exclusivity agreement meant the profile could now be scheduled. Evelyn said she'd have Patricia review the timing. Novak said, with the dry warmth of someone who'd been waiting 7 months and was past the point of impatience, that she'd be there whenever Evelyn was ready. Evelyn said, "January. Let's do it in January." She sat for a moment after the call in the foundation office, at the long table with the whiteboard and the second cycle program timeline and the new project maps that were already getting crowded with the architecture of what came next. An expansion to 2 other cities, a partnership with a financial institution that had approached them in September, a mentorship program in the early stages of design that was going to require a kind of operational complexity she was already, quietly, looking forward to. She was 33 years old. She had signed divorce papers at 6 in the morning in January with both hands around a coffee mug and the city 40 stories below her, and a future she had built in the dark before anyone was watching. She looked at the whiteboard. The work was not finished. The work was the kind that was never finished, that just evolved and deepened and grew more intricate as you got better at it, the way any real thing does. She understood this completely, and it didn't frighten her. It was the condition of building something that mattered. You didn't arrive anywhere. You just got to keep working on something worth working on. She picked up her pen. She made a note in the margin of the expansion proposal, small and precise, the way she always wrote. Outside the window, the Chelsea street did its November things. A food cart, a cyclist, two men arguing pleasantly over something trivial, the city moving through its Tuesday afternoon entirely without her permission and entirely without her involvement, enormous and indifferent and magnificent. She looked at the note she'd written. She crossed out one word and replaced it with a better one. She kept working,